Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's fireside chat with Gretel. We'll be discussing how to accelerate data access in healthcare. My name is Lipika Ramaswamy. I'll be hosting the session today. I'm an applied scientist at Gretel, where I work on the algorithms that generate synthetic data. And I also focus on privacy preserving technologies. So I'd like to introduce our panelists now. These are researchers and practitioners who are working with AI in healthcare. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Anmol Arora from the University of Cambridge. Anmol, would you like to say a few words about your background and experience?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. So my name's Anmol. I'm a clinical researcher based at Cambridge in the UK. My work focuses on the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning in healthcare, and my specific interest is on the use of synthetic data, mainly as a privacy-preserving technique. So looking to see how we can perform clinical studies using synthetic instead of real data without needing to handle real patients' data, which have their concerns of confidentiality and consent. I've done work with other research groups such as Moorfields Eye Hospital, as well as some work with the National Health Service here in the UK, dealing with population health data. And thanks for inviting me.
Amazing. Thanks, Anmol. It's lovely to have you here. Next, we have Finn Jansen, a data scientist from Roche. Finn, care to say a few words about yourself?
Yeah, very happy to be here to discuss this very, very interesting and relevant topic with you all today. I'm Finn. I'm a data scientist at Roche. I've been exploring synthetic data for a couple of years now. Also interested in generative technology, and another key interest of mine is AI for bias and fairness. So making sure that anything we do, we make sure we're not propagating bias, or even better, we're making our AI be used for more fair and equitable outcomes.
Excellent. Thanks, Finn. Excited to learn more about your experience during our chat. Finally, we have Dr. Yili Zhang from Georgetown University. Yili, would you like to give a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Yili Zhang from Georgetown University Medical Center. Currently, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Georgetown. So my research interests includes data governance, clinical data prediction, and disparities in the healthcare. And I'm also involved in the utilization, adoption, and evaluation of synthetic data in the cancer research. So thanks for inviting me, and it's great to be here.
Thanks, Yuli. All right. Well, we are so thrilled to have you join Gretel for this talk today. And we're all here to discuss how to accelerate data access in healthcare and how synthetic data can solve many challenges in the industry, including privacy and data access. So a great place to get started is just to give a simple overview of what synthetic data is, in case the concept is new to anyone in the audience. So synthetic data is data that is generated by computer algorithms or simulations as an alternative to real world data. So we're thinking, any type of data can be synthetic: images, videos, text, tabular, and any combination of these. And I'm sure our panelists use one or many of these modalities in the synthetic world. And so the way we generate synthetic data is using generative models. So you might be familiar with pre-trained transformers of the GPT style. You can also use any number of deep learning methods and statistical methods. And really the goal of these methods is to learn the underlying statistical properties of a data set that you might have. So, we're trying to understand what is contained in the population and how do we learn that, or how does a model learn that? And then how do we sample more data that looks like that? So that's a little bit of what it is, how we make it. And then there's the big question of why. Why do we use synthetic data? And for that, I'd like to turn to our panelists. Finn, could you describe why you use synthetic data and how you integrate it into your work?
So I have a bit of a unique journey on that one about how we discovered it. So we had an internal hackathon, a challenge, and one of the themes was social consciousness, one of the achievement criteria. And we had been interested in a while in GANs because, of course, it's very interesting to be able to generate new data points. It can be used for many different things, especially in the case of images. So we ended up taking Sharon Zhao's GAN or generative AI course. And we started to apply this on really a proof of concept to see if we could make our data sets balanced and to include more data points of marginalized or underrepresented groups, so that the training data could be more encompassing of those groups. So that's really how it got started. Since then, I've been involved in many other sort of talks, use cases, and research projects on this. So really, I think how it gets integrated into work, at least from a pharma perspective, I think pharma companies are interested in using synthetic data to really accelerate innovation, I would say, accelerate research. It can take months, years, or sometimes an infinite amount of time to get your hands on data. I think if you were able to use synthetic data to prototype something that can get in the hands of someone else who can then do some initial analysis, that could accelerate timelines. Or we could be even more ambitious and we could say high quality synthetic data might be able to save a patient cohort and half the amount of people you need for a clinical trial. That is definitely the long-term goal. The models are getting better and better, but it's definitely not there just yet. And we are exploring many privacy PETs, privacy enhancing technologies. But what we notice is the more we learn about synthetic data and the more challenges we learn, the more we learn about these other privacy methods and why they're useful for certain cases and not. But in my job as a data scientist, I focus basically just on synthetic data as a privacy measure.
I think you're on mute.
Yeah, so that's it. I'm happy to,
Oh,
I guess.
am I back? Sorry. I was just asking Anmol to chime in.
Sure, yeah, thank you. Actually, my journey is fairly similar to Finn's in that it was also the use of GANs which attracted me to synthetic data in the first place as well. For me, I came across Ian Goodfellow's paper in 2014 about the introduction to generative adversarial networks, and that's really recognized as a major milestone in machine learning research, really. I mean, I won't excite everyone too much by describing the architecture of GANs, but suffice to say that it's a really novel approach to generating synthetic images in that context. And I started working with it for chest x-rays and eye photos, seeing how we could create fake images instead of real images. The idea being that these days there's so much information you can extract from simple data points like chest x-rays or eye photos. So from eye photos, you can get information about people's age, sex, ethnicity, diabetes status, blood pressure even, just from a simple eye photo. And if you're able to get all of that, then it makes you question whether eye photos are really anonymous anymore. And there's thousands of eye photos out there on the internet, and it makes you question, well, these were all released on the internet with the expectation they'd be anonymous. Are they still anonymous? Do we still have consent to have them out there? Should they still be open access for research? And that's why I started getting interested in using synthetic images instead. The idea being that this realistically is probably the way we're going to be sharing data in the future. And now I've moved on to things like tabular data and population health analysis as well, but the principles are the same in that respect.
Very nice. Yili, what has your experience been like?
So my experience is most like practice-driven cases. Like in our center, we have education programs that we want to train the students to use machine learning models to have real practice of the clinical data. But to guide the IRB approval for every student is very time-consuming. But we really want them to use the center, the data from our center to get to know how the data performs in the models. That's why we started to pursue synthetic data to preserve part of the distributions and the shapes of the patient cohort and the data in the real world. And the other reason is that when we do the cancer research, you know, the cancer data is always hard to obtain, and there is always small number in it. cancer data that when we do like machine learning models or deep learning models, there's always lack of records in our training data. So we also want to use synthetic data and see if that synthetic data can augment our training set and improve our models. And yeah, there's another reason that there are always some patients and are present in a cohort, like patients with rare cancer diseases, that there is even less records for recorded for those type of patient. And with synthetic data, we can generate more records for those type of patient so that we can investigate more for those rare disease.
Right. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like what you all are using synthetic data for is when either you don't have access to a lot of data of high quality, or you're concerned about the privacy of the data, or you're trying to sort of address representation in a data set. And all of these things are so connected. And it's kind of awesome that we get to use, as one technology or a suite of models that are very similar to address all these different problems.
Exactly.
So we touched on how everyone got started with synthetic data, but I'd love to learn what you all think are some of the biggest barriers to using synthetic data in healthcare. I know, Anmol, you have thoughts on this. Why don't you get us started?
Yeah, I think it's an important question, really, and I quite like that we're getting straight into the practicalities involved with synthetic data. So just to give a bit of context then, there's two ways in which you want to assess any synthetic data: the fidelity, or how close it is to real data, and the privacy, how far away it is from real data. And there's always going to be a trade-off between those two things. And in my mind, we've got some pretty good metrics for measuring the fidelity of synthetic data. We can reasonably well tell if it's close to the real data. But what does worry me, what keeps me up at night, is how we assess privacy of synthetic data. Because there are lots of different metrics for assessing privacy. A lot of academic groups have developed their own metrics, which they routinely use. A lot of companies have developed their own metrics, which they routinely use. And there's not a lot of consensus there. If you look at one research group or company and try and compare their privacy metric to another, it's like chalk and cheese a lot of the time. And when I speak to data protection officers and real privacy experts, they don't worry too much about how close it is to the real data or whether it's usable when you're doing analysis. What worries them about whether they can actually adopt this technology is privacy metrics. So whenever I speak to kind of synthetic data companies or people interested, I always say, pay attention to the privacy metrics and make sure you know what you're looking at when you're reading them. And I think there's a lot of potential for future work in that field, specifically in synthetic data privacy analysis.
All right, I hear you on the privacy metrics and the privacy side of the house. That is certainly my research interest as well. So I'm very happy to hear that. I want to dig into that a bit more, but first I want to hear from Finn and Yili also what they see as the biggest barriers.
I'm sure all of us who have approached privacy in this space are all having the same yes, he said it reaction right now, because maybe that is the biggest barrier. There's a strong case for it. I think what I've observed really is more of a machine learning operations challenge, which is basically how to make sure you're showing that you can actually do this by having the infrastructure and the expertise at hand. So a small group of us might pitch synthetic data. Oh, look, it could give us data access. It could allow us to speed up some clinical trials. Well, that doesn't help if we don't have a data engineering team or an MLOps team or a DevOps team to take our solution and embed it into an ML operations system. So really, I think that just speaks to the lack of maturity of most companies, that they probably wouldn't be ready to adopt synthetic data. And so what I think will happen is there'll probably be more and more organizations like Gretel who offer kind of taking the work out of it for the companies or the academics. So yeah, I think really there just needs to be a marriage between the current skills gap and what is needed to actually productionalize synthetic data. And if there's one thing about MLOps, it's usually that the data is more important than the model. So I really think the barrier to adoption might just be whether data is ready to be put into this more advanced analytics pipeline, which most companies are not. Most companies are absolutely not ready for that.
That makes a lot of sense on the ML ops side. Yili, what about you? What's your experience been?
Yeah, I agree with Finn that for me, the most important barrier is that the medical data is hard to standardize, though there are some standardization rules. So with different formats of medical data that we have to customize on that, both in the pre-processing and post-processing. So it's hard to standardize the data, so there is no standardized pipeline to generate synthetic data for in medical research and medical data. So that's the biggest challenge for me, that I have to divide it. I have to investigate in the data format and find a way to feed that into the generative model for synthetic data generation.
Right, I hear you on the different data types and different sort of formats in which data is stored, which systems you get them from determines their structure, how columns are stored.
Yeah, you have to use different strategy each time when you deal with different data.
Right, that's a lot of manual work when dealing with especially legacy systems, it sounds like. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I want to dive into this privacy question now. So, or rather, yes, the privacy question first. So it's a common theme that came up in a lot of our pre-webinar questions, right? And it's around privacy of synthetic data. We're talking about healthcare. We're talking about information about real individuals or real processes, and things that are highly sensitive. So when working with data that contains a lot of sensitive private information, like patient records, or you mentioned, like cancer trials and whatnot, how do you think about preserving privacy? Given that we have a little bit of a gap in terms of metrics, how do you think about privacy when you're working with that data? And Finn, I'd like you to start.
Yeah, sure. So I'm sure we'll have some interesting thoughts pulled together on this one. So basically, privacy, it's really essential with patient records, or indeed a lot of medical information in general. It's a really, really challenging problem because basically there are many steps that occur through synthetic data generation before it even ends up in the hands it needs to be in, whoever wants to use that data. So we, of course, have laws, GDPR laws in America. They have the California state laws and other regulatory requirements that limits what you can do with a person's data. And we've been seeing with Meta and Instagram over the past few weeks, just fine after fine after fine. So that's something all of us are going to avoid. We want to be ethical. We want to operate within a legal framework. So the challenge is, how do you get something that was drawn up by a legal body, and how do you make that match something that is largely mathematical in its process and its description? So it's very difficult to do, especially because it's a lot of new technology as well. So how do we think about preserving privacy? I mean, I'll just outline some of the key approaches we have, but generally it's something like you have a model that learns a patient population, and to ensure extra levels of safety, to ensure that you're not going to create a new record that corresponds to a real person, you can add some noise. So you basically make your model a little bit worse on average, but the privacy gain is significant, even if the quality loss is relatively low. So that's a very basic way. I'm sure we'll dive into differential privacy, but I just want to maybe flag up like my main take on this, which is it's very difficult right now to guarantee privacy, because you could have a privacy guarantee where it basically eliminates any risk of leaking that data, but that metric can change with different teams. So two people work on differential privacy could end up with a different score because of how they implemented it. And this is just an issue right now. It could become less of an issue if we standardize the approach. But it's not just that. It's getting, key stakeholders to accept your interpretation of the law. So as a data scientist, I could look at this privacy score and feel pretty good. I'd put my own data in there and feel like there'd be no risk. But that doesn't mean I can convince a non-technical party that my privacy level is anything more than an arbitrary fabrication on my end. Now, there are more examples of privacy. Apple's been releasing some information about how they use differential privacy, but they've been met with controversy. They've been met with people who recognize that the value of the privacy they demonstrate or they market, it's not interpretable. It doesn't mean it has the same privacy guarantee that we would require in healthcare, which would be a lot more significant. So yeah, I'll stop talking because that is a very interesting topic for me. But yeah, happy to pass the torch.
Yuli, why don't you continue the thought there, given you work with patient data?
That from my practice, that we have to preserve the privacy for patients before we upload our data to the cloud. So if there's any like synthetic data generation platform on the cloud, we have to remove the sensitive information in our local, and then we upload to the cloud. So in this case, the generated synthetic data may lose some of the important features such as date or the geolocation. So I think, yeah, like for us, yeah, it might be better to have some of the tools that we can process locally to retain all the needs, all the needed features for our research use. And that's so because we have to follow the HIPAA rules. So that's mostly the privacy concerns from our end.
Got it. Because there is HIPAA, which is this regulation that's been there for a long time. I suppose you have processes in place that meet that.
Yes.
At least to hit that regulatory mark.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Anmol, what about you?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe if I bridge the two kind of things that have been discussed. On one side, we've got, as you were just saying, the HIPAA compliance and how you actually store the data. So you need to make sure data is being stored in a trusted research environment. You need to make sure it's consistent with any legislation in your relevant area. Here in the UK, it's more GDPR and UK-specific legislation rather than HIPAA, but it's more or less the similar kind of stuff we're talking about. And on the other hand, like Finn was saying, you need to be careful about these definitions of anonymity and how you measure privacy from a legislative perspective. I mean, the GDPR guidance has some specifics on how you class data as anonymous, which is relevant to synthetic data. So for something to be classed as synthetic data, really, compared to real data, it needs a low risk of re-identification. So you can't single people out from the synthetic data set. It needs a low risk of inference. So you can't infer specific information about a person from the synthetic data. And there should be a low risk of linkage between different data sets. So you shouldn't be able to piece together who someone is by having access to different data sets. And that's a very kind of abstract, high-level overview of what the legislation is. But those are the kind of metrics you'd be wanting to assess. And there are some open source tools. Well, there's one open source tool to try and give you a score for each of those three. But I think it's really early in development. And kind of as I was saying before to the previous question, I'd really like to see more robust validation in that kind of area.
What tool is that, Anmol?
That's the status anemometer, which I like to use, but it's quite difficult to compare things between projects, and there's limitations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that certainly makes sense. I mean, the question of using differential privacy and something that is so mathematical to describe something to a regulator or describe something to a legal body. I mean, that's certainly a challenge because the guarantee of differential privacy is also a probabilistic one, which is that with a high probability, there won't be any data leakage. Or with a high probability, you won't be able to tell that my data or Anmol's data or Finn's data or Yili's data was in a data set that was used to train a generative model that produces, right, synthetic records. And so because there's this mathematical chain through which the data flows, it's a little bit difficult to take, an epsilon delta guarantee, which are privacy parameters that describe differential privacy. It's hard to take that and say, all right, this meets the highest bar unless your epsilon is incredibly low. And so it becomes a little bit challenging. I think one of the things that we've tried to do at Gretel, and a model that I specifically spent a lot of time building, was just called tabular differential privacy, or tabular DP. And it's a statistical model that enables a user to generate synthetic data with very, very stringent privacy guarantees. So like an epsilon that's a fraction smaller than 1, and a delta that's much smaller than 1 over the number of records. And these are privacy parameters. If you're not familiar with them, anyone in the audience, just feel free to Google for our blog post on this, where I've described this in greater detail. But these are the two parameters that you want to hit with differential privacy, and you want to make sure that, right, the guarantee that you're providing is very strong, especially when dealing with information about people. And the way I like to think about it is that guarantee, I think about it as if my data was introduced into the data set, or it was removed from the data set with the outputs changed by that much. Now, it doesn't mean that the ultimate model is not going to learn anything about the population. Anything that could have been learned without my data and can be learned with my data is always out there. But it's a difficult thing to take these numbers and then link them specifically to a regulation, because all of it depends on A, what type of data you're working with, B, the number of patients in your data set also determines like how much privacy effectively you need to have. And the third thing is like, what's your concept of an outlier, right? If I'm an outlier in a data set, if I'm either too young or too old for a population, maybe it makes sense to not have me in there. And so a lot of these questions, like there's only so much that the algorithm and these parameters can control. There's a lot more that has to be taken into account, such as the specific situation of the specific data set that we're working with. What do you all think about that?
Yeah, I think I strongly agree with that. I also maybe just want to briefly mention, so when you have a machine learning model, again, if you have a very small sample size, there's a good chance it'll just generate a real person, because it doesn't have enough diversity to make like a novel person. So that's why we use this differential privacy, to see that it's not memorizing real people, basically.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. That really helps. Certainly, it's like harder to hide when you're in a smaller crowd, right? Like if you're in a very large stadium, it's much easier thinking about it a little visually. But...
Yeah, so I just want to add to that. So that analogy really works, because even if differential privacy looks good, there's a different kind of DP, which is differential privacy for groups. So if you belong to a certain like demographic group, even if the differential privacy overall is good, the differential privacy for your subgroup might mean you're more at risk of being identified or being like shared against your rights.
Yeah, that's certainly worth calling out, group privacy and those notions. Yeah, certainly in populations that are small within a larger population. Yeah, very nice. So given all this discussion on privacy, I'm curious, at the moment, do you all have a way of reconciling regulatory frameworks and with metrics? These technical metrics that we've discussed are sometimes a little elusive and can vary. Finn, I'm going to ask you to start again. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Happy to. So, very good question. I think I'll tackle this question from two different angles, but basically, just if we take this question at its face value, the idea of we have some framework, some requirements, how do we reconcile that with the work we do? So, we take it and we make sure that we understand it enough. So it's very interdisciplinary. So there'll be legal teams, legal experts, maybe people who have dealt with regulatory bodies or regulatory frameworks before. And you need to make sure that whatever technical method you have, whatever code you have, it needs to be fulfilling that standard. So I think, Amel, you mentioned a few linkability. That's one of the GDPR concerns for privacy. If you can link someone from a data set, you could argue that's an invasion of privacy. So, linkability, how do you convert that into a technical metric? Well, that's where the more technical science, data science comes into it. So you might find an open source solution, ideally a solution that's been proved. So you can see other companies or other academics have used this. It doesn't necessarily mean that they've taken very critical data, anonymized it with synthetic data, and then used it. That's not what I mean. What I mean is, like, has there been proven value between two parties who are aiming to use synthetic data? Because it starts with these kind of like smaller use cases where we can demonstrate value, and that will help regulatory bodies and healthcare experts to understand the tech, which means they can improve the regulatory frameworks based on insights that we've helped them to generate. So there's two sides to this. So one is, how do we convert this into code, technical metrics? The other one is, how do we change the landscape so that everyone is better off with a framework?
Having it be more of an interaction between sort of regulators and technical folks, rather than just being, here's the commandment, now follow it. Yili, what do you think?
Like in our case, that so when considering about privacy, that we usually just simply remove the sensitive columns, and but we at the same time we want to preserve some of the important information, like the patient age at the time of diagnosis, or the time to treatment at the time to treatment after the diagnosis. So we will calculate those type of numbers before that, or we shift the date a little bit to retain the actual value from the real data.
Right, that makes sense. So actually fitting into the regulatory framework, and then going ahead and using technology. Yeah, that's that makes a lot of sense, especially given HIPAA's. It's right there. Anmol, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I can really just echo what's already been said, because I wouldn't dare disagree with Yili or Finn. No, I mean, I completely agree. And actually, it's interesting, Yili, mentioning just redacting sensitive information, because actually that's one of the simplest and most effective ways of making sure you're compliant and getting rid of sensitive data. Synthetic data is obviously an alternative to that if you still feel like you require that information for analysis. I think the only other thing I can add is to say that I think we will need updating of regulatory frameworks in this context. I think there's a real legal loophole really with synthetic data. And if you Google synthetic data legal loophole, you'll find a paper I wrote in the Lancet about the exact thing. But yeah, there's unethical use cases of synthetic data, I'll say, and I think that's well beyond the remit of this talk, but I think we will need to update our frameworks, and moving just beyond anonymity and GDPR, but also thinking about what we're using the algorithms for and what we're using the synthetic data for. But it's a topic for the future. Yeah,
certainly a lot to discuss there, but we'll look up the article that you wrote and give it a shout. All right. So we've talked a lot about the privacy side of the house, and always with synthetic data or anything that's privacy preserving, we also want to think about quality, right? Like, we're trying to use synthetic data to do something useful at the end of the day. And so I'm curious, how do you evaluate the quality of synthetic data specifically for your use cases? Yili, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So we we evaluate the quality of data basically through the fitness of use of synthetic data, like how the data can serve the needs to pursue your certain goals. So there are several dimensions, like privacy we discussed just now is one, and there are cohort selection and also prediction. So for privacy, that we want to evaluate the risks that how the real data can be identified from the synthetic data. So one way to evaluate that is we can mimic the process that others may do to the synthetic data to identify the real data from it. We can mimic this process and evaluate the risks. And for cohort selection, there are different levels of cohort selection that if you want to use the synthetic data to present the real distribution of your clinical cohort without displaying the sensitive data to public. So when evaluate the cohort selection, the first level is the feature distribution. For example, if you want to check, if you have a cancer data set that you want to check how close the distribution of each type of cancer distributed in the data set and how close that is from the real data to the synthetic data. And the other level is feature correlation. So that corresponds to the correlation between two or more columns. Let's say beyond the distribution of type of cancer you want to check, you may also want to check the age distribution in each type of cancer. So that relates to the correlation between two columns, the diagnosis and age. So that is a higher level that you want to check, evaluate how close that is from the real data to synthetic data. And there's another level that we call clinical knowledge compliance in the synthetic data. Let's say, like for patients, those patients who have female anatomy, they are not likely to get male genital system type of cancer, and vice versa for the patients who have male anatomy. So we also want to evaluate how the generative model can train the data and get that type of knowledge and also present that in the synthetic data. So that is also the other thing that we want to evaluate and avoid the violations in those type of cases. And the other dimension is the model prediction, that we also want to know how well the synthetic data performs in the linear or machine learning models. So would synthetic data provide better, higher accuracy in the training models, or if we use synthetic data to augment our original data in the machine learning models, whether that will provide higher accuracy or performances. Those will be very interesting to evaluate and explore. So in our case, that as what we tested, the feature distribution is, so in synthetic data, the feature distribution is better than the feature correlation, and that is also better in the clinical knowledge compliance because of its complexity level. And for model prediction, the linear model performs better than the machine learning models for synthetic data. So that's how we evaluate that in those dimensions.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. You're looking at one-dimensional, two-dimensional, multi-dimensional, also looking at whether records can actually be validated, like if they make sense from sort of just like a common sense perspective, And then how do they do on these models that you actually want to use the data for to learn something?
Yeah, because we really generate a data dashboard for the other users or people who are not familiar with our data to check for the descriptive or statistical summary of our data. So we check every violations, and we don't want any data not make sense in the synthetic data.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to cut to one final question before we move on to Q&A. And this is sort of high level, and I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on this. Where do you see the future of AI in medical research and healthcare? Anmol, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, there's two categories, right? There's where do you see deductive AI, so predictive models to try and diagnose things earlier, and there's the generative side, where do you see generative models being used. So on the deductive side, I think there's huge potential to streamline diagnoses and to rapidly triage patients. So, for example, in radiology, where a lot of the hype is in terms of triaging which scans require more urgent radiologist attention. In terms of the generative side, which is more the focus of this webinar, I guess, I think there's huge potential for synthetic data to streamline the research process. So I think we'll hopefully see a lot more synthetic data being released into the open. I'd like to see a future where we're releasing open access synthetic data sets so that people can start to reproduce others' work. Currently, we have a problem in research where we've got loads of brilliant papers coming out performing machine learning data analysis. And when you read the data availability statements at the end, it says data cannot be released because of confidentiality or access requirements. And the purpose of publishing really is to allow other people to try and reproduce your efforts and make sure it's robust. And if you're not able to access any data to try and do that, then, well, you lose a little bit of trust in that. So I'm hoping that we might start to see more and more synthetic data being released alongside research. And I also think we can start seeing research being sped up, with the idea being that if you're submitting a research study application and you're trying to get access to data, it'll take you 6 to 12 months in the best of times to get access to that data to do a study in healthcare. And you don't even know if it'll work. You don't know if you'll be able to do it, or if you can do it, whether you'll actually get any decent results. But if you're able to start with some synthetic data and experiment a bit first with that, see how you'll make your model, see what exactly it is you're looking for and whether it's feasible, then you can submit your research application with a little bit more confidence you'll be able to get somewhere. And hopefully we'll see higher quality studies there and studies that are sped up a little bit. Those are kind of the understudied use cases I like to think about, really.
Very nice. Finn, what about you?
Yeah, get plus one for everything he said. I very strongly agree. It's also it's Oops, my mic just moved a bit. It's exponential, right? Because if we get some data, we get synthetic data we could use. That means more downstream AI applications as well. It's not perfect because, of course, real data is better than synthetic data, but it's nonetheless still an improvement. But I'm very excited about the future of AI in medical research. We really have so many interesting data points that we can capture about people, studies, hospitals, and doctors. And it's anything from genomics to feedback they've given to their doctors to heart, step, and sleep rate from wearables to social media interaction. So when we can kind of reach this AI maturity phase where we can leverage all of these data points, we can make some really, really targeted predictions. We could reduce patient risks. We could improve the drug development process, accelerate it. And really, I think just in general, every person will benefit from AI in healthcare. With the one caveat, and this is a very important topic to me, the one caveat would be marginalized groups are often remaining marginalized while the majority or the ones with the privilege get more of the privilege or get more privilege. So I think it's very important that we don't allow this future of AI to be one that's very much in line with sort of big tech, Amazon, which was very notorious for a recruitment tool that discriminated against women. There's a violation of various laws as well. So just to make sure that we position AI and data collection in such a way where the marginalized groups stand to benefit, rather than just creating decision-making systems through AI that will perpetuate these harms.
That makes sense. Certainly using generative models as a complement to discriminative models. Ely, what about you?
Yeah, I agree. So, so from my perspective, that the restriction of current decision-making predictions are restricted with one type of data, like one type of certain type of data, like imaging, medical imaging, or natural language or structured data. But you know, like a patient with same pathology or same lab tests, like two patients have the same pathology or lab test, they can perform very different in the clinics. So that provides the restriction that if we only use one type of data for the prediction models. So in future, if there's model can be developed by leveraging all the types of data and simulating like the decision process from physicians, we can emerge all the natural language, medical imaging, and structured data to train those type of data at the same time. So I think that would be one of the future interests. And so for synthetic data, that if we can like produce the digital simulation of a person with their structured data and the medical imaging at the same time. So to mimic a human body, the data for that. So that can also help a lot that to help us to investigate in AI for different types and varieties of healthcare cases. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense and almost brings us back a little bit full circle, where at the start we were talking about how synthetic data can be of any type, and you're suggesting it should be of every type.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. We have just under 10 minutes left, and we should now move to the live Q&A. I think we have a few questions that have come in, and we'll wait for them to pop up on the screen. All right. Well, a question from Arthur. My question concerns the integration of these solutions and technologies into healthcare-related places. For instance, hospitals work with a lot of rules, processes, old habits. So I wonder how we can integrate new technology like AI solutions or real private data access technology to this type of place without breaking or too much changing all the habits of the medical staff in order to give them useful tools and facilitate some processes without creating more complexity in their jobs. Would anyone like to take this question?
I could share a few thoughts. I could also reference some news people may be aware of about the NHS having a digital skills shortage. So it's not just synthetic data. We're talking data collection. We're talking basic predictive modeling, not even AI, sometimes just basic linear regressions. So really, I think hospitals have to confront this issue internally. How does a hospital become a bit more digitally aware or digitally capable? But then that comes back to us. So it's up to us to partner with them, to do knowledge sharing opportunities, to create useful proof of concepts, so we can show them exactly how this fits with their needs or some of their aspirations. But at the same time, what we're continuing to do is simplify this technology. So GANs have been around for a while, but only recently has it been easy to get a pre-trained model that has been trained already and that you could use to generate some images of like a lung image, a disease for a lung. So yeah, I think that's kind of my approach, but I'm very keen to learn about how we can do this together.
Yeah, and I can just add, so I work clinically as well in the hospital, and I always see there's a big disconnect when you speak about this kind of machine learning research in healthcare and what's actually happening on the ground, because a lot of these tools require some infrastructure that just quite simply doesn't exist really in a lot of hospitals. A lot of hospitals really still use paper records, and the idea of starting to apply synthetic data is a distant future. And I think when we talk about, as Arthur, who wrote the question, said, rules, processes, old habits, I think we do need to start to rethink our infrastructure that we're using in healthcare. And there are all sorts of stakeholders we need to involve there. The main ones are healthcare providers and clinicians, as well as governments who are providing the resources. Industry, so people who are developing this stuff, need to have a good view of what's happening in the real world. And perhaps most importantly, the patients as well, because especially in places like the NHS, if it's not accepted by the public, it'll never get anywhere. And so we need to bring people on board.
Yeah, certainly the specifics depend on which country we're in and what sort of jurisdiction we're under. But those all make a lot of sense. All right. I think we have time for another question from Sarah. Suppose you're trying to build an algorithm that's going to be clinically approved by the FDA. How will you prove that synthetic data performs equivalently to and matches the complexity and variability of real-world data? Also, is there any way to prove that the synthetic data doesn't suffer from biases learned from the underlying generative model?
I do have some thoughts, so I'll happily take this one. Basically, we talked earlier about quality. So how do you assess the quality of your synthetic data? But really, another way to think of it is the word utility. So, for example, if I am working in healthcare and I have a machine learning algorithm that can take in some information about a patient, and then it can predict if that person is sick or not, right? Just a very simple example. Well, in the case of synthetic data, if I can generate some synthetic data, use this to train the model instead of the real data, and then the model performs on some real test, some real patients, we can then use that result to see if it's capturing the same properties, if it's capturing the same insights. So generally what happens is, that's just an example that doesn't happen. So it's I would say maybe the word compromise comes into heads, because as data scientists, we can prove to you that the means are the same, that there's correlations are the same, that the feature independence is the same. We can demonstrate to you this mathematically. But when you have like a complicated data set, such as longitudinal, so maybe each patient has several entries in the data set, so maybe different lab visits over time. Now that's way harder to capture because it's high dimensional data. And that's really, synthetic data is actually probably in its infancy within this longitudinal space. It has a long way to go before it's very useful. So yeah, utility. Can you use synthetic data through the same process and get the same output? That's just a very generalized way to think of it. But also very much you need your SMEs, you need your subject matter experts to help you to assess the data. If they can identify some clinical traits that it's missing or that should be there, then you have an argument for insufficient quality. So I think I'm a little bit more interested to answer the second part of that question, because it's kind of how I got started with all of this. How do we ensure bias doesn't crop up in the synthetic data? So the first question is, well, what is bias? Because there are many ways. There's systematic bias, cognitive bias, there's statistical bias, which is more in terms of the model. So my question to you is, what bias do you mean? But I'll just try to answer as broadly as possible. We need to do bias checks in more rigor and more depth than we currently do, not just for synthetic data, but for machine learning in general. Because there are a very small set of libraries that allow you to assess for bias. And those libraries are only covering a few kinds of bias. Those libraries are covering biases like discrimination based off demographic parity. Two groups are not getting the same accuracy. So that's one example of bias. But there's many other kinds of bias, because there's bias in the fact that in your patient cohort, there's only 5% African Americans. That's a form of bias. But it's a real world bias, because in America, African American men are unlikely to go to clinical trials. So the question is, where does bias start? And it really starts in the world, and it can creep right back into the model and right back into the data. So we need to, as sort of technologists, more broadly speaking, software engineers, data scientists, we need to come up with more rigorous standards for assessing bias and fairness, and to ensure that any synthetic data we generate has been put through this process as well.
That certainly makes a lot of sense. All right. I think we are at time now, unless Anmol or Yili, you have some final thoughts on this question.
Yeah, just
that you'd
one
like to
thing
share.
that I want to mention is that there is always a trade-off between the privacy and the utility. That if you want very unbiased data for your synthetic data, there might be a downside for the privacy part. So it's always good to keep in mind how to balance the privacy and the utility for your cases. Yeah.
Absolutely. And just a quick word, just say that I think that answers probably a couple of questions that were in the chat about outliers. Because if you are trying to maximize fidelity and closely match the real data, you'll pick up outliers. But that's at the cost of potentially the expense of their privacy in the data set if they're genuine outliers. If you've only got one patient who's over 100 in a data set, a real data set, and you generate a synthetic data set, and there's only one patient over 100, the linkability or re-identification risk is pretty high with them. So if you're trying to get rid of outliers, it's going to be at the cost of utility. So there's always going to be that trade-off, as Yili says.
Certainly, to learn about outliers, there are other techniques that typically involve learning about those specific outliers, and maybe not outliers that look like the outliers, and how many of those can you create. So thank you, everyone, for your participation, Anmol, Finn, Yili, and thank you so much to our audience for all the questions. I know we've had a lot of questions. We thank you for your interest. We'll try to follow up with anyone who didn't get their question answered. We really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for joining us in this fireside chat.